At 72 years old, Adelaide Voss stood on the porch of the farmhouse she had built with her own two hands and watched her sons carry her belongings out to the road, one crate at a time, as though she were a tenant who had simply overstayed her welcome. Her eldest, Thomas, had decided the farm would fetch a better price without an aging mother clinging to a back bedroom, and her younger son, Caleb, too weak or too indifferent to object, had simply looked away while it happened. She left with $81 saved from decades of egg money and mending work, a trunk of clothes, and a stubborn refusal to beg anyone for shelter. 3 days later, in the fading river town of Willow Bend, she paid $6 for an overgrown, half-collapsed homestead nobody else wanted, a place whispered about for its sunken garden and its long-sealed stone cellar. She told herself it was simply shelter. She did not yet know that beneath that cellar's rusted door waited something sealed away before her own birth, something that would not only give her back a life worth living, but would settle an old debt the whole town of Willow Bend had long since forgotten it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Voss. If you have ever been made to feel like a burden in a place you helped build, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Adelaide had been born Adelaide Jane Marsh in 1854 in a modest cabin on the eastern edge of the Missouri River Bluffs, the only surviving child of a stubborn, quietly capable woman named Constance Marsh, who had buried 2 infants before Adelaide and had resolved, after that grief, to raise a surviving daughter with a fierce, practical independence rather than the fragile sentimentality some mothers wrapped around an only child. Constance's own mother had been a root cellar keeper of considerable local reputation, a woman who understood, in an era before reliable refrigeration, exactly how to keep a family fed through a hard winter using nothing but careful digging, proper drainage, and an intimate knowledge of which vegetables would keep and which would rot if stored too close together. And Constance had passed that knowledge down to Adelaide with the same unsentimental thoroughness she applied to everything else in life. Adelaide's father, a quiet riverboat carpenter named Elias Marsh, spent long stretches away working the river trade, and it was largely Constance who shaped Adelaide's early understanding of the world, teaching her not only how to dig and line a proper cellar against flooding and frost, but how to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm long before the sky gave any obvious warning. A skill that had saved more than one household in that river valley from disaster when the sudden, violent weather common to the Missouri Bluffs came without the courtesy of long notice. Constance often told her daughter that a root cellar, properly built, was not merely a hole dug into the earth for storage, but was, in its truest sense, a covenant of family made with the land, an acknowledgement that hardship would come again regardless of how comfortable the present moment felt, and that the discipline of preparing for it, patiently and without complaint, was itself a form of quiet faith rather than mere practicality. Adelaide absorbed this conviction so thoroughly that by the time she was 12, neighboring families had begun asking her opinion on where best to site a new cellar or storm shelter, trusting the serious, careful girl judgment in a way that startled some of the grown men who found themselves taking instruction from a child. She married Franklin Voss in 1872, when she was 18, and he was a broad-shouldered, hard-working young farmer of 22 who had recently taken over his late father's modest acreage along the same stretch of river bluffs where Adelaide had grown up. Franklin possessed a steady, uncomplicated devotion to the land and to Adelaide herself, and though he lacked his wife's particular expertise in cellar work and storm reading, he had the good sense to defer to her judgment on such matters from the very beginning of their marriage, a deference that likely saved their small homestead more than once when Adelaide insisted on reinforcing a shelter or delaying a planting based on some subtle shift in the wind that Franklin himself could never quite articulate but had learned, over the years, to trust without question. Together they built a modest farmhouse on land Franklin inherited near the growing river settlement that would eventually become Willow Bend, and beneath that farmhouse, in the years before their first son was born, Adelaide dug and lined, with her own hands and Franklin's steady assistance, a deep and carefully constructed storm cellar, built not merely as a place to weather violent weather but as a proper root cellar besides, its walls lined with field stone and its drainage channeled with the same patient expertise her mother had taught her, a structure Adelaide privately regarded as the truest expression of the care and permanence she hoped to build into her new family's life. Thomas was born in 1874, and Caleb followed 3 years later, and Adelaide raised both boys with the same unsentimental practicality her own mother had shown her, teaching them to work the land, to respect the discipline of preparation, and to understand, or so she believed at the time, the quiet dignity of hard, honest labor performed without complaint. Franklin's health began a slow decline through the 1890s, a series of ailments that left him increasingly unable to manage the physical demands of the farm, and it fell to Adelaide, alongside her now-grown sons, to keep the homestead functioning through years that grew steadily leaner as regional crop prices fluctuated and a series of difficult harvests tested the family's resilience. Franklin died in the winter of 1901, leaving the farm's legal ownership, through an arrangement made years earlier that Adelaide had never thought to question, jointly to their two sons rather than to her, a common enough practice of the era that Adelaide had accepted without much concern at the time, trusting that her sons would honor their father's memory by ensuring their mother continued place in the home she had built alongside him. For nearly 2 decades after Franklin's death, that trust seemed well placed, with Adelaide continuing to manage the household practical affairs, her sons deferring to her judgment on matters of storage, provisioning, and the small but essential domestic economies that kept a working farm solvent through lean years, even as both sons married and brought their own growing families into the increasingly crowded farmhouse. The fall that stripped Adelaide of the only home she had ever truly built began not with a single dramatic betrayal, but with a slow accumulation of small dismissals that she recognized, only in retrospect, as the early tremors of decision her sons had been quietly circling for years. Thomas, who had always possessed a sharper appetite for advancement than his father ever had, began speaking with increasing frequency about the farm's declining profitability compared to the prices being offered by land speculators eager to consolidate smaller river bluff holdings into larger, more efficient operations. And though Adelaide initially dismissed this talk as idle frustration common to difficult years, she came to understand, over the course of a particularly hard winter in 1925, that Thomas had been in active, ongoing correspondence with one such speculator, a well-capitalized outfit operating out of the county seat, about the possibility of selling the entire property outright. Caleb, gentler by temperament but weaker in will, raised no meaningful objection when Thomas began framing their aging mother's presence in the household as an impediment to a clean sale, suggesting to his brother, in conversations Adelaide was clearly not meant to overhear, that a widow of 72 years occupying a back bedroom made the property considerably less attractive to buyers seeking a fresh start on land, and that some arrangement would need to be made before serious negotiations could proceed. Adelaide confronted her sons directly when the truth of their intentions became undeniable, reminding Thomas in particular that she had dug the very storm cellar beneath the house they now proposed to sell out from under her, that she had kept this family fed through winters that would have broken lesser households. But Thomas, hardened by whatever calculation had settled into him over the preceding years, informed her with a briskness that struck her as almost businesslike that sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with the family's practical future, and that she would need to make other arrangements within the month. She spent that final month doing what she had always done in hardship, working methodically rather than surrendering to despair, quietly cataloging and selling what personal possessions she could part with to build a small reserve of cash, and reaching out, with what dignity remained to her, to a cousin 2 counties over who politely but firmly declined to take in an elderly relation she barely remembered. When the appointed day arrived, Adelaide stood on the porch and watched her own sons carry her trunk and remaining belongings out to the roadside, Thomas avoiding her eyes entirely while Caleb offered a mumbled, inadequate apology that did nothing to soften the finality of what was happening, and she walked away from that farmhouse with $81, a trunk of clothes and linens, her mother's old root cellar tools wrapped carefully in canvas, and a stubborn refusal to let her son see how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath her. She made her way, over the following days, to the fading river town of Willow Bend, a place that had grown up not far from her childhood home along the same bluffs, now somewhat diminished from its earlier prosperity as regional trade patterns had shifted away from the smaller river landings toward the railroad towns further inland. She took a room, paid for by the week, above a boarding house run by a widow named Sarah Pruitt, a kind but businesslike woman who made clear that charity had its limits and that Adelaide would need permanent arrangements before too many weeks passed. It was during her second week in Willow Bend, walking the town's quieter back streets to clear her mind, that Adelaide came upon a property that immediately caught her professional attention despite its obvious decay, a small overgrown homestead at the edge of town whose most notable feature, visible even from the road, was a strange sunken depression in the yard where a garden had apparently once stood, and whose most notorious feature, according to the handful of townsfolk she cautiously inquired with, was a long-sealed storm cellar that local children dared each other to approach but never to open, rumored among the town's older residents to be somehow cursed or at very least deeply unlucky, connected in vague, half-remembered ways to a family that had left Willow Bend under some cloud of scandal decades earlier. The property's current owner, an elderly widower named Cyrus Bellamy who had inherited it from a distant relation and had no interest in either living there or investing in its repair, was eager enough to be rid of it that when Adelaide made an inquiry, he named a price of $6 almost apologetically, clearly expecting her to laugh at the very suggestion of purchasing such a decrepit, ill-reputed place. Adelaide did not laugh. Something in her, some old instinct sharpened by decades of reading land and weather and the particular quality of a well-sited cellar, told her that a homestead built with that kind of storm shelter, however neglected, held more value than its reputation suggested, and she paid Cyrus Bellamy his $6 before he could reconsider his offer, walking away with a deed to a ruin that not a single other soul in Willow Bend believed was worth the paper it was written on. She moved into the crumbling little house the following morning, finding it barely more weatherproof than a shed, its roof patched with age and its floors warped from years of neglect, but livable enough for a woman who had learned long ago how to make very little stretch considerably further than it had any right to. Her first order of business, before even properly settling her few belongings, was the storm cellar itself, both because her professional instincts demanded a proper inspection and because the townsfolk's vague, superstitious warnings had only sharpened her curiosity rather than dampening it. She found the cellar door exactly where the sunken depression in the yard suggested it would be, a heavy wooden hatch reinforced with iron strapping, sealed shut not merely by rust and time, but by what appeared to be a deliberate wooden bar wedged across its frame from the outside, as though someone, decades earlier, had gone to considerable trouble to ensure the cellar remained closed rather than simply neglected. It took her the better part of an afternoon, working alone with tools salvaged from her mother's old canvas wrap kit, to work the rusted bar loose and pry the hatch open against decades of settled earth and swollen wood, and when she finally descended the narrow stone steps into the cellar's cool, close darkness, lantern held carefully before her, she found a space considerably larger and more carefully constructed than the crude storm shelters common to hastily built homesteads, its walls, lined with the same expert fieldstone masonry her own mother had taught her to recognize as a work of someone who understood proper drainage and structural soundness far better than the average frontier farmer. What first caught her attention, once her eyes adjusted to the lantern's modest light, was not treasure or papers, but simply the cellar's unusual proportions, extending further back into the earth than the modest surface footprint of the house above would suggest, with a second, narrower chamber visible through a low stone archway at the rear, itself sealed by another door, smaller than the first and secured with a padlock whose iron had rusted nearly solid with age. Reasoning that whatever waited behind that inner door had been sealed away with considerably more deliberate care than simple storm preparation required, Adelaide spent that first evening simply sitting in the cellar's outer chamber, studying the masonry and the layout with the same patient, methodical attention her mother had trained into her decades earlier, understanding intuitively that a structure built with as much careful intention had been built to protect something specific rather than merely to shelter a family from bad weather. It took her nearly a week, working carefully each day with tools and patience rather than force, to finally break the rusted padlock and work open the cellar's inner door, and when she finally stepped through into that smaller, drier chamber, lantern raised, she found herself standing before what had clearly once been a modest but deliberately equipped hiding place, its walls lined not with stone alone but with old, weathered wooden shelving, and upon those shelves, wrapped in oilcloth gone, brittle with age, a collection of ledgers, personal letters, and a small, strong box whose lock, protected from the worst of the damp by the chamber's careful construction, had survived considerably better than she expected. Reading by lantern light that evening, having carried the materials up to her small kitchen table, Adelaide began to piece together, with growing astonishment, the story of a family who had built this cellar and sealed away its inner chamber so carefully decades before her own arrival in Willow Bend. The papers belonged, according to their careful, faded script, to a family named Coswell, who had settled this homestead in the years immediately following the Civil War, and whose patriarch, a man named Silas Coswell, had served as Willow Bend's informal banker in the years before the town possessed any proper financial institution, holding, in the trust-based arrangements common to small frontier communities of that era, deposits and saving for a considerable number of local families who had no other safe means of securing their modest wealth. Silas Coswell's ledgers documented, in painstaking detail, the deposits of some 40 families across nearly a decade, sums accumulated through years of careful farming and trading, entrusted to Silas precisely because his reputation for honesty and his carefully constructed storm cellar, built with unusual sophistication for a modest frontier farmer, made him seem the safest possible keeper of a community's collective savings. But the ledgers told a darker story as well, one that unfolded gradually as Adelaide worked through the brittle pages, describing how Silas Coswell's own son, a young man named Amos Coswell, had discovered his father's role as informal banker and had, over a period of roughly 2 years documented in increasingly anxious entries, begun quietly siphoning funds from the very deposits his father had sworn to protect. Funds Amos apparently used to finance a series of speculative land purchases. Further west that ultimately collapsed, leaving him deeply indebted to interests considerably less patient than the trusting farmers of Willow Bend. The final entries in Silas Coswell's own hand, dated in the autumn of 1878, described his devastating discovery of his son's betrayal, his desperate efforts to recover what funds he could before the theft became public knowledge and destroyed both his family's standing and the town's fragile trust in its own informal institutions, and his decision, ultimately, to seal away what remained of the community's original deposits, along with his own careful documentation of exactly what had been taken, and from whom, in this hidden inner chamber, intending, his final letter explained with evident anguish, to somehow make restitution before the truth became known, a resolution he apparently never lived to fulfill, as town records Adelaide later confirmed showed Silas Coswell dying suddenly of illness that same winter, with Amos Coswell disappearing from Willow Bend entirely not long after, the family's remaining property passing through a series of distant relations before eventually reaching the disinterested Cyrus Bellamy, who had sold it to Adelaide for $6 without the faintest idea of what his own inherited property concealed. The strong box itself held a modest but meaningful sum in gold and silver coin, considerably more than Adelaide's $81, along with Silas Coswell's careful final accounting of precisely which Willow Bend families had lost deposits and in what amounts, a document that Adelaide understood with growing clarity as she studied it late into that night, represented not merely old history, but a debt the town of Willow Bend had never known it was owed since Silas Coswell's death and Amos's disappearance had allowed the original theft to fade entirely from public memory, remembered now, if at all, only in the vague, superstitious warnings townsfolk attached to a cellar they no longer understood the true history of. Adelaide did not act rashly with what she had found, though her own considerably reduced circumstances gave her every practical reason to simply keep the recovered funds for her own use and say nothing further about their origin. Instead, working with the same patient, methodical thoroughness that had once made her a trusted authority on matters of storage and preparation throughout her farming years, she spent the following weeks quietly researching Willow Bend's older families, visiting the town's small church records and a handful of elderly residents who still remembered, however dimly, stories passed down about the Coswell family's disgrace, cross-referencing what fragments of memory she could gather against Silas Coswell's precise, damning ledgers, and confirming, family by family, that several of the town's current residents were direct descendants of the very depositors whose trust had been so thoroughly betrayed nearly 5 decades earlier. It was during this careful research that Adelaide's inquiries drew the attention of Willow Bend's current town clerk, a sharp, ambitious man named Harlengreave, who held considerable informal influence over the town's affairs and who, Adelaide discovered with some unease, was himself a great-nephew of Amos Coswell, a family connection Harlan had apparently kept quiet given the old scandal's lingering, if faded, unsavory associations. When word reached Harlan that the new owner of the old Coswell property had been asking pointed questions about old family debts and had been seen carrying strong boxes and ledgers to the county courthouse, his response carried none of the polite indifference Adelaide might have expected from a stranger with no personal stake in the matter. He confronted her directly outside the Mercantile one autumn afternoon, informing her with a barely concealed edge beneath his official courtesy that whatever old papers he believed she had found held no proper legal standing after so many decades, that a woman new to Willow Bend with no established standing in the community would find few people willing to disrupt old settled history over unverifiable claims, and that she would be wise to consider the disruption such claims might cause to families who had long since made their peace with losses attributed, in the town's collective and conveniently vague memory, simply to hard times rather than to any specific act of theft. Adelaide recognized in Harlengreave's tone an uncomfortable echo of her own son's dismissive certainty, the particular confidence of a man accustomed to having his version of events accepted without serious challenge, and something in her, The same quiet steel that had once made neighboring farmers trust a 12-year-old girl's judgment on cellar placement simply refused to yield to it. The weeks that followed brought the particular resistance a small, tightly connected town can mount against an outsider threatening to disturb comfortable old narratives, with Harlan quietly suggesting to various shopkeepers and church members that the new widow at the old Coswell place seemed prone to strange fixations about ancient history nobody else much cared to revisit, a narrative that gained some traction until Adelaide, working with the same painstaking method Silas Coswell's own, ledgers had modeled for her, secured corroborating testimony from 3 elderly residents who still remembered fragments of their own grandparents' old grievances about money entrusted to Silas Coswell and never properly accounted for, and located, through persistent searching in the county courthouse's oldest records, an original probate filing from Silas Coswell's estate that referenced, in cautious legal language, unresolved financial obligations to unnamed local depositors, a filing that had never been properly settled or explained, and that matched precisely the names and figures documented in the ledgers Adelaide had found. The reckoning arrived at a town meeting that Adelaide herself requested be called, ostensibly to discuss proposal for improving the town's modest cemetery grounds, but attended, once word spread of what the new resident intended to present, by a considerable portion of Willow Bend's older families, and when Adelaide stood to speak, Silas Coswell's original ledgers in one hand and the corroborating probate filing in the other, the whole settled into the particular silence that comes when a community realizes it is about to hear something that will require it to revise a story it had comfortably stopped questioning decades ago. She read the relevant entries carefully and without embellishment, naming the families whose deposits had been recorded, describing Silas Coswell's own anguished final efforts to make things right, and presenting the recovered funds not as her own windfall, but as a debt she intended to see properly settled, a presentation that left even Harlan grieved, standing near the back of the hall, unable to muster his earlier dismissive confidence in the face of documentation so thoroughly corroborated. The justice that followed unfolded with a particular quiet dignity that suited both the story's age and Adelaide's own showy temperament, with the recovered funds, modest as they were after nearly 5 decades, distributed among the identifiable descendants of Silas Coswell's original depositors in amounts calculated as fairly as the old records allowed, a process Adelaide oversaw personally with the same careful, unsentimental precision her mother had once brought to root cellar accounting. Harlan Grieve, standing in Willow Bend, suffered a quiet but unmistakable diminishment. Townsfolk who had once deferred readily to his opinions now regarding him with a new wariness once his family's old connection to the Coswell theft became common knowledge, and he found himself, in the following months, gently but firmly eased out of the informal influence he had long enjoyed over the town's affairs, a consequence that arrived not through any dramatic confrontation, but simply through the slow, natural erosion of trust that follows when a community learns a person's silence had served their own family's comfort rather than the town's honest history. Adelaide herself, rather than keeping any significant portion of the recovered funds to her own considerable needs, used a modest sum to properly repair her small homestead's roof and foundation, restored the storm cellar itself to full working order as both shelter and proper root storage in the tradition her mother had taught her, and established, with the remaining portion, a small standing fund of the town's newly formed bank to assist elderly residents facing housing hardship, a fund she oversaw personally and which quietly became known, in the years that followed, simply as the Cellar Fund, its true origins understood by those who needed to know and left gently unspoken for those who did not. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began, with a 72-year-old woman standing on a porch watching her own sons carry her belongings out to the road, paying $6 days later for decrepit, ill-reputed homestead nobody else in Willow Bend believed held any worth whatsoever. Thomas and Caleb had looked at their aging mother and seen only an inconvenience standing between themselves and a profitable sale, and the town of Willow Bend had looked at the old Coswell property's sealed cellar and seen only superstition and neglect not worth the trouble of investigating. Both judgments mistook age and disrepair for emptiness, mistook what had simply been quietly sealed away for what held no remaining worth at all. What waited behind that rusted inner door was never merely coin, though the coin mattered enormously to a woman who had walked away from her home with only $81 to her name. What waited there was one frightened, grieving father's unfinished attempt to make right a betrayal he lacked the time left to properly resolve, entrusted finally, by nothing more than chance and an elderly woman's stubborn refusal to dismiss a well-built cellar as mere superstition, to the one person capable of finishing what he had started. Adelaide Voss, cast aside and underestimated by her own sons, became the one who carried that old, unfinished justice its last necessary distance, and in doing so she gave Willow Ben back something no $6 purchase should have reasonably been expected to provide, proof that a woman's careful, patient knowledge, however easily dismissed by those closest to her, could still, in the right circumstances, prove more valuable than anything her own family had been willing to see in her. Thank you for spending this time with Adelaide's story and with all of ours here tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need the reminder that being cast aside and being without worth are never quite the same thing. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.